Dawn, 1363. A low fog clung to the surface of Lake Poyang like a sheet drawn over sleeping wood. Out on the water, masts loomed through the haze, tall wooden towers bristling with men, archers, and piles of grain. A fleet that from a distance resembled a line of floating citadels. At the center of that seething mass stood a single flagship, its deck crowded, its bows splintered from recent clashes. On that deck, a man surveyed the scene with a narrowing calm. If he failed here, the dream of a native dynasty might die with him. If he succeeded, the balance of power across China could tilt irreversibly. This was not merely a battle over a city or a lake. It was, in microcosm, a contest between two systems. An embattled imperial order shaped by decades of ecological disaster and administrative decay, and a new political force forged from hunger, belief, and ruthless organization. What happened on these waters would become one of the most consequential turning points in late medieval East Asia. These are the shocking reasons behind the Mongol Yuan presence in China collapsing. And the story begins here, under a grey morning sky, with oars cutting through shallow water and the air thick with the smell of wet wood and iron. But to understand why this encounter mattered so much, we must rewind 20 years and follow the chain of disasters and choices that made such a confrontation possible. The land first began to fail. Central and northern China had not simply suffered isolated bad years. The mid-14th century brought a cascade of environmental shocks and human calamity. Rivers that once irrigated fertile plains turned violent. The Yellow River, notorious for its temperament, burst its banks in 1344 in a flood that reshaped channels, drowned fields, and forced entire villages to relocate. Dikes and canals, the sinews of traditional Chinese agriculture and transport, were left broken and silt-choked. Crops failed in sequence, grain stores emptied. Where food was scarce, taxation and forced labor, already heavy under Mongol rule, felt like a personal devastation. At roughly the same time, plague crept across trade routes and into towns. Chroniclers would later conflate the famines and epidemics into a single, catastrophic collapse. Modern scholars treat the evidence with more caution, but the outline remains stark. Mortality rose, markets shrank, hinterlands were depopulated, peasants fled or raided to survive, social bonds frayed. In several provinces, village registers recorded dramatic population drops. Where once the state could depend on a steady stream of corvée labor and soldiers, the pool of available people had shrunk or been rendered unwilling. In late imperial China, political legitimacy was not measured solely by force, but by a moral calculus that linked heaven's favor to earthly prosperity. The doctrine known as the Mandate of Heaven held that extraordinary natural disasters indicated a ruler's moral failure and signaled the shifting winds of legitimacy. For centuries, this idea had underpinned dynastic change. By the 1340s and 1350s, with rivers breaking dikes, famines sweeping the land, and rumors of plague spreading from market to market, the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty's claim to divine sanction looked increasingly tenuous to those suffering in the provinces. At the same time, the machinery of governance that could have mitigated these crises was groaning under corruption and mismanagement. Local officials, often appointed by distant courts and removed from peasant suffering, sometimes operated as extractive agents rather than stewards. Accounts from the time accused tax collectors of piling burdens on an already broken countryside. Labor parties sent to repair dikes were reportedly short-handed, poorly supplied, and brutal in enforcement. Conscription into military service grew more arbitrary. In short, the state's attempt to preserve what power it had left often deepened the grievances fueling rebellion. From these conditions emerged a new political force, millenarian and insurgent movements that blended religious promise with practical resistance. The Red Turbans were the largest and most significant of these. Rooted in heterodox Buddhist sects, often under the label of the White Lotus. They preached both spiritual salvation and social deliverance, promising a return to order under a ruler with a right to heaven's favor. Their banners appealed both to the desperate and the ambitious. Those fleeing hunger joined for protection, while local elites saw an opportunity for power. Out of this roiling soup of decay and hope rose a number of charismatic figures. Two would come to shape the decisive contest on Lake Poyang, Zhu Yuanzhang and Chen Yuliang. Their paths to that lake were markedly different in origin, personality, and method. Their collision would be shaped as much by circumstance and environment as by their choices. Zhu Yuanzhang, often romanized as Zhu Yuanzhang, sometimes seen in older texts as Chu Yuanchang, began life at the very margins of subsistence. Born into a poor peasant family, the orphaned boy's trajectory took him through monasteries and refugee camps, then into the ranks of local rebel bands, where he quickly demonstrated an ability to organize, administer, and, when necessary, strike ruthlessly. He was not merely a frontline fighter. He built networks, political, economic, and military, that allowed him to translate local defeats into long-term gains. Accounts highlight his attention to logistics, securing grain, recruiting capable lieutenants, and establishing discipline in a region where law and property had been eroded by famine and theft. Importantly, Zhu combined ideological appeal with pragmatic governance. He and his circle framed their rebellion in moral terms, claiming the mandate of heaven in a way that resonated with popular suffering, while simultaneously instituting measures of order where they gained control. In villages under his protection, taxes were sometimes lighter than under UN officials, and courts operated with a degree of predictability. Such small improvements, in a time of chronic insecurity, worked like magnets for the displaced and the resentful. Chen Yuliang's ascent followed a maritime and mercantile logic. Born in a riverside community, he knew the water as intimately as Zhu knew the land. Early life as a fishery worker and later as a local strongman gave him the instincts to marshal men and vessels in a way that few inland commanders could match. Where Zhu triumphed through supply and administration, Chen amassed naval power. Great tower ships, platforms of timber that carried men, cannon, and fortifications. Shallow draft vessels capable of navigating the shifting shallows of lakes and river mouths. Fleets built for endurance and shock. Chen's Great Han, as he styled his polity, leaned heavily on maritime superiority and a belief that size conferred invincibility. His tower ships were an imposing sight, multi-storied with raised fighting decks and platforms for crossbows and early gunpowder weapons. To contemporaries, such vessels could seem like mobile fortresses, especially in restricted waters such as Lake Poyang, where maneuver space was limited and massed flotillas could interlock into defensive chains. Yet personality shaped tactics. Contemporary chronicles and modern historians both note Chen's confidence and, some suggest, a streak of impatience. Where Zhu cultivated alliances and built administrative practices that could absorb defeated foes, Chen often relied on forced recruitment and the subordination of local elites. In some areas he was a liberator, in others an extractor. The accounts that survive give a portrait of a commander who understood the spectacle of power, the towering ships as a demonstration of authority, but perhaps underappreciated the limits of that spectacle when weather or cunning intervened. Between these two men stood a landscape of fractured loyalties and competing claimants. Han Liner served as a nominal figurehead for parts of the Red Turban movement. Local bosses like Zhang Shicheng established rival kingdoms in the south, while wavering gentries tried to balance survival with allegiance. The late UN period was not simply a pairwise struggle. It was a crowded theater of warlords, pretenders, and opportunists, all navigating the same currents of famine, rumor, and legitimacy. Naval warfare in this theater was not what many modern imaginations imagine. It was rarely about blue oceans and long bows. Instead, It unfolded in networks of lakes, rivers and canals, where water levels rose and fell with the seasons, and where the depth of a channel could decide victory as decisively as the courage of a crew. Lake Poyang itself, in Jiangxi province, was at once wide and shallow. Its shoals shifted with storms and drought. Its causeways could strand entire squadrons on a single sandbar. Commanders who controlled the water's moods, through timing, local pilots or sheer luck, held a decisive advantage. Ships of the period must be pictured in practical terms. Tower ships were heavy, high-sided vessels built to absorb missile fire and to serve as elevated platforms for archers and early artillery. Their draft, the depth of water a vessel needs to float, was significant. They performed best in deeper water where their bulk could be used without risk of grounding. Shallow draft boats, by contrast, sat higher on the water and could operate where the lake was thin and treacherous, skirting shoals and using shallower channels to outflank heavier foes. Gunpowder weapons, bombards, fire lances and hand-thrown combustibles were part of the arsenals, but their use on wooden decks added a new set of hazards. Combustible materials, gusting winds, and the proximity of flaming projectiles made naval battles especially susceptible to catastrophic conflagrations. Fire ships, vessels laden with combustibles and designed to be set adrift into enemy formations, were a known tactic. They were terrifyingly effective when wind and tide cooperated, and they turned the presence of gunpowder on a wooden ship from an asset into a liability. All of this technology and geography collapsed into strategic choices in the summer of 1363. Chen Yuliang laid siege to a key point of supply and symbolic importance, an effort to consolidate control over the south and to choke the lifeblood of Zhu's nascent power. Zhu, for his part, resolved to relieve the pressure. The stakes were not abstract. A starved city might surrender, its resources falling into Chen's hands, tipping the balance of territory, manpower, and legitimacy. Estimates of the fleets involved are contested in the sources. Some contemporary chronicles inflate numbers as part of post-war storytelling. Modern historians debate their plausibility. One retrospective suggests that Chen commanded several hundred ships, some claim up to 1,000 or more, while Zhu's forces may have been considerably smaller, perhaps a few hundred vessels at most. Other scholars argue for smaller figures across the board. What is less disputed is the qualitative gap. Chen's navy relied on larger, heavier ships, while Zhu's contingent included a greater proportion of shallow draft boats and lighter, more maneuverable vessels. This disparity in design and doctrine would shape the coming engagement. The approach itself was a study in high-risk timing. Lake Poyang's depths were not constant that year. A summer drought had lowered the waterline, exposing sandbars and narrowing channels. For larger vessels, this was dangerous territory. For smaller ships, it offered channels of surprise. Zhu's commanders understood this. Zhu himself, according to later accounts, was willing to gamble with tactical mobility rather than brute force. He ordered a relief column to sail out and bring food and reinforcements to the beleaguered city, an operation that required threading narrow U-shaped channels under the watchful guns of Chen's fleet. The first clash occurred as fleets sighted each other in a morning haze. Contemporary chronicle descriptions are vivid and at times inconsistent. Faithful reconstruction must therefore be cautious. On the approach, several of Zhu's boats ran afoul of submerged shoals, shallow humps of sand that lay just beneath the water's surface. In places, oars scraped and hulls shuddered against the lake bed. Immobilized boats became islands of vulnerability. From Chen's taller fighting platforms, archers and bombardiers rained down missiles. Heavier guns could not always be re-aimed rapidly in such constricted waters, but they were still deadly when a target stayed within range. Zhu's force suffered losses, ships burnt, crews slaughtered, men taken captive or swept away in the currents. Sources vary widely on the number of ships lost in this opening exchange. One chronicle lists several dozen, another claims hundreds. Scholars urge caution and recommend treating these as indicative rather than precise. The human scene was stark. Survivors later recalled, if the chronicles are to be believed, a sense of chaos as boats became entangled, oars fouled, and commanders shouted orders that could not be heard over the clang of metal and the screams of the wounded. For soldiers, a lake could be a tomb. The cold water claimed many who fell, and the shallow mud could hold a man fast as surely as a rope. For commanders like Zhu and Chen, these were not just tactical setbacks. They were reputational stakes. A fleet that grounded publicly invited ridicule and the loss of confidence among allies and subordinates. By midday, the contest had become one of attrition and improvisation. Zhu's leaders fought to keep the relief channel open, to move grain and men ashore, and to prevent Chen's larger vessels from encircling the littoral towns supplying them. Chen sought to press his advantage, using his tower ships as mobile fortresses, forming chains of hulls linked together to create an anchored bulwark. In doing so, he hoped to smother the smaller boats and turn the lake into a static killing ground where his superiority in mass and height would tell. To many observers, this seemed the sensible plan. In narrow waters, fixed strength could neutralize maneuver. Yet the lake did not belong to either man alone. Weather and tides, forces independent of human will, began to play their part. A wind shift, a sudden gust from the southeast that raised small waves and pushed surface currents, could alter how fire moved across the decks, how boats caught a breeze, and crucially, how a burning raft would track into a formation. Knowledge of local pilots, men who read the lake like a book, was as important as any cannon. As dusk fell on one of those early engagement days, both sides paused to lick their wounds. Chen's anchored chain presented a daunting silhouette against the darkening sky, a ragged necklace of ships, lanterns bobbing like hostile stars. Zhu's flotilla lay scattered but not broken. Some commanders advocated withdrawal. Others, with Zhu's close counsel, argued that retreat would mean losing the supply line, and with it, more than just food. The symbol of resistance in the region might crumble. It was then that both ingenuity and desperation began to set the stage for tactics that would be remembered for centuries. On Zhu's side, there were men who understood that brute force alone could not answer the problem posed by Chen's massed ships. An advisor famed in later accounts for his strategic insight, Liu Ji, known in some sources as a scholar-turned-military thinker, suggested a weaponization of the basic elements, using fire, timing, and wind to turn Chen's strength into a liability. Fire ships, packed with combustibles and slow-burning materials, would be sent into the enemy chain when the wind was favorable. The raising of flames against timber and tar would convert Chen's decked platforms from fortresses to furnaces. The plan was simple in concept and perilous in execution. It relied not on outgunning the enemy, but on harnessing chaos. On Chen's side, commanders debated whether to stay anchored and keep the chain tight, or to attempt to break formations and seek deeper water. Many of his lieutenants argued for the chain. In static defense, they believed, their tower ships would reign supreme. Others counseled caution, warning that a stray spark could turn an anchored fleet into a funeral pyre. As night gathered, both camps set their watches. Sailors mended rigging by lantern light. Carpenters patched hulls with fresh boards. Priests chanted soft invocations at the prow and stern. The air smelled of tar, boiled rice, and the iron tang of blood where wounds had been patched. Commanders moved like vultures, assessing morale and weighing contingency. Gifts of grain were distributed to secure loyalty. Threats were whispered to supporters suspected of wavering. In the small hours, with only reed torches and the gut-churning motion of waves for company, what each commander could not know were the precise gusts the lake would send at dawn, the exact timing of a fire's spread, or the human error that turns a planned move into catastrophe. In those hours, the stakes became personal. Zhu, who had known hunger and the precariousness of support, could not afford to fail publicly. Each routed convoy could strip away hard-won legitimacy. Chen, who had built an image out of towering ships and quick conquests, risked seeming brittle if his fleet was burned or its center pierced. Each leader had reasons, practical and reputational, not to yield. The next morning would bring new maneuvers and fresh danger. Men who had prepared for a pitched naval battle found themselves confronting a series of choices between prudence and audacity. The ground for the decisive move, the wind, the sandbars, the layout of the chained fleet, had been set by forces neither commander controlled. And yet, it would be those commanders who decided how to use what nature had handed them. Before dawn the following day, some captains on Zhu's side rowed in whisper-silent boats to test channels and scout the enemy's chain. They found places where the water ran a touch deeper, seams between the linked vessels where a small boat might slip through. They also found the smell of oil and resin in the air, signs that the enemy had prepared for the possibility that fire might be used against them. Chen's men, it seemed, were not indifferent to the danger of burning ships. They had long prepared countermeasures, dousing stations, watchmen with buckets, and an insistence on keeping distance where they could. Yet preparations are not guarantees. One mistake, a misjudged oar stroke, a misread wind, a lantern accidentally upended by a startled sailor, could turn a chain of hulks into a corridor of flames. And so the two forces circled in a tense standoff, the morning light catching on the lake and throwing gold bands across splintered wood. Each commander waited, calculating the odds. Each understood that this engagement was more than a regional skirmish. Victory here would mean the absorption of territory, manpower, and authority. But even if Zhu were to win, that would be only one element in a larger decay of Mongol power. Victory could be converted into state-building only through subsequent policies, administration, and consolidation. The battle could provide the opening. It could not by itself guarantee the outcome of an empire in decline. The first real maneuver of weight came as the sun tilted higher and the breeze began to shift. Small boats, laden with bundles of kindling prepared under orders from Zhu's commanders, drifted like pale ghosts toward the enemy knots. Men watched with bated breath. On the chain, lookouts saw the movement and hollered warnings. Buckets of water were manhandled to the rails, but water in the right wind could not always outrun flame. What followed in the immediate sequence of the first full day's fighting would be reported differently in countless accounts. Some touting heroic improvisation, others accusing cowardice or treachery. The basic outline is clear enough. In constricted water, with a wind that changed direction unpredictably, several of Zhu's craft became stuck on shoals. Chen's gunners exploited the immobilization. Zhu's commanders lost ships and men in a chaotic melee. The relief missions suffered grievous damage. Yet despite the losses, the relief attempt was not wholly undone. Some grain reached the starving city, some men disembarked and bolstered defenses. The image of victory and total annihilation was not realized on either side. At dusk, both sides counted losses and tended wounds. On the shore, refugees who had watched from the safety of bank or reed-smudged huts saw the lake stained with oil and smeared with flotsam. For civilians, the battle was both a spectacle and a new source of peril. Prolonged conflict meant crops left untended, and soldiers foraging for food increased the pressure on already thin stores. Each boat burned or scuppered carried with it not just a tactical setback, but a human crisis for families waiting for grain. It was in this liminal moment, after the first day's chaos, before the next decisive blow, that commanders on both sides began to rethink. Chen, having tasted the resilience of his opponent, considered whether his reliance on size and static defense had made his fleet vulnerable to modes of attack it had not been designed to repel. Ju, bruised but unbowed, weighed whether to press an improvisatory incendiary tactic or to withdraw and lick wounds. Counselors urged caution, ideologues pushed for boldness. The lake, patient and indifferent, kept its secrets close to the surface. What made this episode more than a tactical confluence of wind and wood was the context into which it fell. The Mongol Empire state, already under strain from ecological and demographic shocks, faced simultaneously a loss of administrative legitimacy and a multiplicity of uprisings across its territory. A single naval defeat would hardly topple an empire on its own. But a string of defeats, seized opportunistically by a cohesive rival with both political program and administrative talent, could become a tipping point. There is the first level of the answer to the title. Ecological collapse and state misrule created openings. Insurgent leaders with organizational vision could exploit them. Battlefield innovation and luck could transform temporary tactical success into strategic ascendancy. The men rowing to the small coves and the captains stacking grain on shaky decks did not think in these grand terms. Their world was immediate. Oars in the water, night cold on their backs, the brittle resonance of a shouted order. But actions in the water that week would ripple outward, altering allegiances, attracting or repelling mercenaries, and shaping local elites' decisions about whom to support. One of the pivotal human elements rarely captured by dry annals was the psychology of commanders who had risen from scarcity. Ju's reputation for discipline and a pragmatic streak, his readiness to coerce, reward, and integrate, meant that defeated foes could often be folded into his apparatus. He did not merely win battles, he consolidated control. Chen, conversely, who showcased impressive maritime engineering and martial daring, sometimes failed to transform military triumph into durable civil administration in newly captured areas. This contrast would matter in the months after any decisive engagement. The winner needed to be able to turn battlefield gains into functioning governance. Without grain distribution, tax collection, and legal order, victory dissolved into pillage and rebirth of resistance. As stars blinked over the lake, the stage set by environmental decline, political decay, charred supply lines, and daring tactics settled into a tense calm. Lanterns bobbed on decks, and the men who had survived the day huddled where they could. Ju, who had learned to value networks as much as boldness, mapped future moves in his head. How to secure supply corridors, how to exploit local pilots' knowledge, and how to press a psychological edge while avoiding overreach. Chen, whose fleet had demonstrated both its strengths and vulnerabilities, considered whether to tighten his chain and risk becoming a mobile coffin or to redeploy into deeper water where his heavy vessels could maneuver with less hazard. Beyond the immediate tactical choices, both men had an eye on the broader political chessboard. The fractured nature of the Red Turban movement meant that alliances could be fickle. A commander who screamed victory too loudly might alarm other regional leaders into opposing him. A leader perceived as weak could be swallowed by rivals. The balance between appearing strong enough to command respect and cautious enough to maintain coalitions would be a delicate calculation. For the many thousands watching this contest, farmers who depended on river trade, merchants who feared the closure of canals, officials who worried about the spread of insurrection, the outcome mattered for survival as much as for history. The Lake Poyang engagement was a crucible in which the tactical, environmental, and political fused. Men fought with bows and fire, but the real weapons of the era included droughts, broken dikes, and the erosion of state legitimacy. These were the pressures that had pushed entire societies toward rupture. And yet, even amid such structural explanations, contingency retained a disproportionate role. A single gust that altered the path of a fire ship, a decision to anchor or to break the chain, the death of one commander in an errant volley. Each could tilt events in ways structural analysis alone cannot capture. The lesson emerging from the morning and dusk of those initial encounters is not a neat, single answer to why the Mongol Yuan presence in China collapsed. Instead, it is a braided one, where natural catastrophe, administrative failure, rising insurgency, innovative tactics, and individual decisions intertwined. As night pressed close over Lake Poyang, the fleets lay within earshot of one another. Men slept poorly, commanders rewired plans, fires were banked and lanterns kept low. On the shore, small groups of villagers huddled, trading rumors and counting the days since their last grain ration. In the wake of first blows, questions proliferated. Could a fire be set that would reach through the chain? Would the wind shift in favor of the assailants or the defenders? Could Zhu turn temporary tactical gains into long-term political consolidation if he succeeded? Could Chen convert his maritime dominance into a sustainable polity across contested hinterlands? These were not just military questions. They were the central uncertainties that would decide whether a regional naval clash could contribute to the larger downfall of a dynasty. The lake, for its part, offered no counsel. Its tides and shoals were indifferent. At the first light of what would be the following day, preparations resumed. Men readied small craft with bundles of pitch and oil, while others on the chained ships sharpened pikes and prepared to tow burning hulks clear. Both sides calculated the wind, surveyed the channels, and waited for motion. Somewhere within the ring of ships, a single arrow, its direction guided by a human hand, its cost magnified by circumstance, had the potential to produce outcomes far beyond the instant of its flight. The fight on Lake Poyang was about to enter a new phase, one that combined premeditated cunning with the caprices of weather and the frailty of human coordination. What followed would decide not only the fate of two fleets, but also accelerate processes that for a generation had been eroding Mongol authority in China. The morning would reveal whether innovation, timing, and leadership could turn the moment into momentum. The answer would determine whether a band of refugees turned soldiers could become founders of a dynasty whose institutions would reshape the land. The pre-dawn hush that had cloaked Lake Poyang fractured with the first crackle of flame. What began as small, controlled blazes aboard outlying skiffs turned, within breathless minutes, into a roaring line of fire that licked up the hulls of the chained flotilla. Wind, capricious, then cruel, caught the first burning craft and drove it like a living thing into the heart of Chen Yuliang's anchored chain. Timber, tar, and canvas fed the inferno. Ropes shrieked and loosened, men hammered at planks slick with oil, and lanterns bobbed as sailors, some screaming, some methodical, tossed water in a desperate, ultimately insufficient effort to smother the blaze. Contemporary accounts diverge on precise details and losses. Chroniclers were not neutral witnesses, and later storytellers inflated heroism and disaster alike. Yet the qualitative turn is unmistakable. Chen's advantage in size and fortification, the very thing designed to make his fleet impregnable, became a vulnerability. Anchored ships, bristling with gun platforms and timber superstructures, offered the flames a raised stage from which to leap. Heavy ships with deep drafts could not easily maneuver out of the path of incendiaries. In the crush and confusion, men jumped into the oily water only to find their garments bound to wood and their exits blocked by planking and sinking spars. Some accounts claim hundreds of ships burned, others give far smaller figures. Modern historians warn against precision. Estimates vary widely, but agree on the turning mechanism. Fire, carried by wind into an anchored formation, made the chain itself into an engine of destruction. In the chaos, a single shot, an arrow loosed by a soldier somewhere in the maelstrom, or perhaps a stray missile from an enemy bombard, found Chen Yuliang. Sources differ about the moment of his death. Some say he fell on deck, struck by an arrow as he tried to rally his men. Others suggest he was wounded, thrown into the water, and died as his fleet disintegrated. What the chroniclers uniformly record is that his fall did not simply remove a commander. It removed the linchpin of a polity whose authority depended heavily on his persona. Where Chen had been a visible centralized symbol of the Great Han, his sudden absence dissolved the fragile glue holding underlings to a common cause. Without his voice to coordinate retreat or reformation, panic metastasized. The psychological and organizational effects were immediate. Sailors who had fought under the spectacle of his towers now found themselves leaderless. Lashings and signals that had once been obeyed became contradictory, then meaningless. A number of vessels attempted to weigh anchor and head for deeper water, but shoals, burning wreckage, and the sheer density of oared craft made coordinated movement perilous. Some captains cut their lines and fled in smaller boats. Others tried to tow burning hulks clear, and instead found their own craft catching fire. The lake filled with smoke and floating embers. The distinct soundscape of battle, oars, shouted commands, the dull thumps of artillery, was replaced by the sharper, more elemental noises of crackling flame and men gasping. Zhu Wanzhang did not watch merely as an opportunist. The relief mission, which until then had been a desperate attempt to move grain and men past an enemy blockade, transformed into a decisive offensive. Liu Ji's proposed tactic, weaponizing the wind and fire, had been risky precisely because it depended on unpredictable variables, gusts, timing, and the capacity of crews to steer burning craft into an enemy mass without succumbing to the conflagration themselves. That morning, those variables, by a combination of preparation and luck, aligned. When dawn came with the smoke still roiling, Chen's fleet was a skeleton of its former bulk. Survivors clustered on the highest parts of hulls or, where possible, scrambled onto smaller boats and sought shore. Zhu's forces, though exhausted and themselves frayed from earlier grounding and losses, seized the moment to press forward. Small, shallow draft vessels darted through seams in the flotilla, cutting ropes, capturing isolated decks, and taking men prisoner. Where Chen's troops had long relied on intimidation and the physical impressiveness of their ships, they now found their platforms collapsing, and their capacity for massed missile barrages diminished. The battle did not end in a single blaze. It morphed into days of maneuver, intermittent blockade, attritional skirmishes, and negotiation. The Great Han's command structure, already taxed by the logistical pressures of maintaining a large fleet, could not reconstitute itself quickly. Supply lines frayed. Disease and hunger, two forces as lethal as any missile, worked on both sides. Men who had been pressed into service, sometimes forcibly recruited from riverside villages, proved unreliable when their families on shore faced the immediate threat of starvation. Desertion rose. In the weeks that followed, Chen's capacity to project power over the surrounding countryside diminished sharply. Chen's death and the effective disintegration of his fleet did not, in isolation, decide the political future of China. But they changed the calculus decisively. With Chen incapacitated, several of his lieutenants sought terms. Others attempted local survival strategies. A few tried to slip away and carve out independent realms. Zhu moved swiftly, both with a general's decisiveness and with an administrator's mind. He offered clemency to many of the captured and besieged, folded competent commanders into his ranks, and, crucially, organized the transport of grain back into contested towns. Grain, in this context, was statecraft. It fed armies, secured loyalty among civilian populations, and provided the tangible signs that a rival could govern. Within months of the burning at Poyang, large swaths of Chen's territory came under Zhu's sway. His absorption of manpower and ships, again, numbers reported in sources vary and are subject to debate, bolstered his military base. More important was the signal it sent to wavering elites across the south. Chen, for all his maritime splendor, could be defeated. Zhu had a model of governance that could secure supply and, through a combination of reward and coercion, create a functioning administrative order. Local gentry, fleeing the chaos wrought by prolonged military competition, increasingly aligned with the faction that promised order and food. This was the crucial link between tactical victory and strategic consequence. The late Yuan state was already brittle for structural reasons. Lake Poyang did what great battles often do in such moments. It accelerated an ongoing process. The Mongol-ruled Yuan dynasty had, over decades, lost its capacity to deliver the basic assurances that underwrote political legitimacy: grain in times of scarcity, reliable justice, and the predictable functioning of local administration. When a challenger like Zhu could demonstrably do those things, albeit in fragmented, emergent ways, local actors recalibrated their loyalties. The mandate of heaven, normally a broad, slow-moving theory of dynastic legitimacy, contracted into immediate, practical judgments. Who could keep the canals open? Who could ensure the granaries? Who provided magistrates who would adjudicate property claims without arbitrary confiscation? By 1364 and into 1365, Zhu's realm expanded through both conquest and annexation. He did not merely seize territory, he set about building the institutional scaffolding necessary to hold it. That work was painstaking and often ruthless. He implemented cadastral surveys to understand tax bases. He reorganized granaries and transport routes to ensure food flowed in times of scarcity. He established military colonies and strengthened local militias to deter banditry. Where the Yuan had relied on distant military elites and ad hoc local arrangements, Zhu cultivated a bureaucracy staffed increasingly by men who owed their status to him. This reconstituted administrative capacity would be one of the factors allowing the emergent Ming to replace Yuan authority in China proper. Yet consolidation also introduced darker tendencies. Zhu's own experiences, raised amid famine, near constant threat, and the brutal necessities of survival, bred in him a remarkable capacity for discipline and organization, and an equally remarkable distrust. The policies that created order often carried with them the seeds of repression. Surveillance networks deepened. The lines between loyalty and suspicion blurred. Purges, particularly in later years once he assumed the throne as the Mongol Emperor, eliminated perceived internal threats, but also removed experts and administrators who might have contributed to more pluralistic forms of governance. These purges would be one of the paradoxes of the new dynasty, stability achieved through sometimes brutal centralization. The fall of the Yuan is often narrated as a sweeping, inevitable transfer of power. Reality was messier. The central Mongol regime retained strength in the north and in some garrison towns for years. The Yuan court, then based at Kunbalik, modern Beijing, was not, in a single afternoon at Poyang, swept away. Instead, it faced a cascade of challenges: loss of revenue from southern tax bases, difficulty projecting power across a vast and fractured landscape, and a series of military defeats and defections that eroded its capacity to mount effective counteroffensives. The Mongol polity's reliance on mobile cavalry and steppe logistics lost some of its comparative advantage in the densely populated, canal-rich agricultural basins of China proper. Moreover, the environmental shocks that had catalyzed the revolt, the river floods, the famines, the migratory pressures induced by plague, had long-term effects on the state's manpower and fiscal base. The broader structural picture matters because it prevents a reductive conclusion. Lake Poyang was decisive, but decisive in the sense of accelerating an already advancing collapse. It provided Zhu with momentum, manpower, and a spectacular narrative of victory that could be translated into legitimacy. But without the deeper currents, ecological distress, administrative exhaustion under Yuan governors, popular millenarian movements, and the fragmentation of elite loyalties, Poyang might have been a costly, tactical victory with little strategic follow-through. After absorbing Chen's remnants, Zhu shifted from consolidation in the south to a broader campaign to claim the imperial mantle. In 1368, he proclaimed himself Emperor of the Ming dynasty, taking Nanjing as a capital and initiating campaigns that would, over the next several years, bring most of China proper under his control. The Yuan remnants withdrew toward Mongolia. Mongol rulers would continue to be a presence on the northern frontier, but their grip over the fertile plains and urban centers that had once sustained the Yuan polity loosened irreparably. The success of Zhu and the Ming project rested on more than military conquest. It hinged on administration, repair and expansion of irrigation and canal systems, re-establishment of grain tribute routes, and reconstitution of a bureaucracy that, even if staffed by men tied directly to the emperor, could perform the everyday tasks of governance. The state invested in demographic recovery, encouraging resettlement of depopulated areas and rebuilding rural communities. These acts mattered immensely in the deeper causal chain because they reversed some of the immediate drivers of the revolt: famine, lawlessness, and the perception that the incumbent regime had lost heaven's favor. And yet this reconstruction had moral and political shadows. Hongwu's later years were marked by suspicion and a ruthless insistence on control. He initiated purges of scholars and officials whom he suspected of fomenting dissent. He used secret police to monitor and, when necessary, eliminate rivals. The very measures that guaranteed the Ming's survival, tight central control, a pervasive intelligence apparatus, and massive mobilizations for public works, also produced a climate of fear that suppressed dissent and stifled alternative administrative innovations. The Ming state became, in some respects, more effective at certain tasks than its predecessor, but also more personally authoritarian in its exercise of power. If we return to the central question, why did the Mongol presence in China collapse? We must place the Battle of Lake Poyang within a braided set of causes. First, ecological shocks had severely weakened the Yuan regime's social and fiscal base. Floods, droughts, crop failures, and epidemic disease reduced manpower, undermined tax revenue, and produced mass dislocation. These were not remote technicalities. They altered the lived experience of millions and delegitimized rulers seen as failing to respond. Second, institutional failure and corruption amplified the ecological crisis. Local officials' extraction, mismanagement of repair projects, and inconsistent conscription practices turned environmental distress into political grievance. When administrative machinery is perceived as exploitative rather than protective, rebellion becomes a rational, even necessary course for survival and change. Third, the rise of insurgent movements provided an organizational vehicle for popular discontent. The Red Turbans and like-minded groups fused religious promise with political action. They could mobilize men rapidly and, crucially, offer an ideological frame, restoration of moral order, that made rebellion more than mere banditry. Millenarian rhetoric translated natural catastrophe into a political story of loss and possible renewal. Fourth, leadership and organization proved decisive. Zhu Yuanzhang's capacity to turn battlefield success into governance, his focus on logistics, bureaucracy, and legitimacy, allowed him to transition from rebel commander to state builder. Chen Yuliang, by contrast, demonstrated the limits of military spectacle. A fleet of towering ships could win battles, but could not alone create durable civil institutions. Where Chen relied heavily on maritime power and a charismatic center, Zhu blended martial success with civil governance, making him better suited to the long task of ruling. Fifth, tactical innovation and environmental contingency mattered in ways that cannot be overstated. The use of fire ships at Lake Poyang, combined with the lake's shallow draft that year and a wind shift, turned Chen's strength into vulnerability. Gunpowder, deployed in novel ways on the water, and the mix of ship designs produced a tactical environment in which adaptability outmatched raw size. Luck, an errant gust, a misfired signal, the death or survival of a single commander, remained a factor in the high-stakes calculus of medieval warfare. These 5 threads, ecology, institutional decay, insurgent mobilization, leadership and organization, and tactical innovation plus contingency intertwined to produce an outcome that was, in its totality, both unsurprising in structural terms and shocking in its immediacy. The fall of the Mongol presence in China was neither purely a long-term inevitability nor the result of an isolated gamble on a lake. It was a sequence in which an already weakened state could not absorb the shock of coordinated insurgency, where a leader with administrative gifts could convert victory into the apparatus of rule, and where the idiosyncrasies of weather and technology could produce irreversible outcomes. The moral complexity of this transformation deserves emphasis. Zhu Yuanzhang emerges in the sources as both founder and autocrat, savior and butcher, organizer and paranoid ruler. His reforms, repairing canals, reconstituting tax registers, re-legalizing civil examinations, were crucial for restoring order and enabling recovery across war-torn regions. Yet his later purges and the creation of a powerful secret police apparatus indicate a ruling style premised on centralized, personal authority that often sacrificed individual lives and liberties on the altar of stability. The Ming dynasty's accomplishments in rebuilding China's agrarian foundations cannot be disentangled from the human cost of consolidation. For the defeated and displaced, soldiers who rode and died on the lake, villagers whose harvests rotted unattended, coastal communities torn between allegiance and survival, the passage from Yuan to Ming was not an abstract dialectic, but a series of wrenching personal experiences. Historical grandeur often masks these human currents. The narrative of dynastic change tends to obfuscate the ordinary suffering that drives and accompanies revolution. Lake Poyang thus functions in history both as a dramatic set-piece and as a symbolic hinge. Its flames illuminated vulnerabilities in a fleet, and by extension, in a regime that had ceased to deliver basic security. But the battle's larger significance lies in how it intersected with pre-existing processes. Environmental catastrophe had eroded the state's base. Bureaucratic decay had alienated the populace. Charismatic insurgents provided direction. Tactical innovation allowed a smaller, more adaptable force to prevail. And leadership choices, on the lake and after, converted momentary advantage into durable institution. If the reasons for the Mongol-Yuan collapse in China can be called shocking, it is because they force us to recognize a duality. History is shaped both by long structural pressures that we can model and by singular contingent events, whose immediate consequences often exceed what structural analysis alone predicts. A flood can hollow a dynasty's economic foundations over decades. An arrow can topple a commander in a single instant. Both matter. Historians look for patterns. Narrators recount moments. The truth of Poyang lies in the union of the two. In the end, Zhu Yuanzhang stood where he had stooped once as an orphaned refugee, over grain, over registers, over the machinery of state. He marshaled human resources and natural resources, weaponized administrative competence, and used both to create a dynasty that would endure for nearly 3 centuries. Yet that endurance was not cost-free. The Ming's stability was purchased with heavy-handed governance and political violence that would define much of its internal life. What, then, should we take away from the story? First, that empires can unravel not merely because of military defeat, but because their social and ecological foundations fail. Second, that insurgents possessing administrative skill and pragmatic tolerance for coercion can outlast and outbuild forces that rely chiefly on spectacle and force. Third, that technology and environment, the shape of ships, the draft of a hull, the direction of the wind, can decisively shape political outcomes in ways that are often underappreciated. Finally, that leadership is morally ambiguous. The same men who create order may also prove ruthless in preserving it. History rarely offers tidy moral judgments. Zhu's life and career present a complex portrait. He was a product of catastrophe who responded with organizational genius, and he then ruled in ways that oscillated between beneficence and brutality. Chen Yuliang's rise and fall reveal the limits of martial splendor without corresponding civil institutions. The lake's fires remind us that sometimes the smallest tactical choices become the pivot on which whole political orders swing. If this account has left you with more questions than answers, that outcome is fitting. Was Zhu a necessary restorer of order, or did his methods sow their own future grievances? Could the Yuan have reformed itself had it managed the ecological crises more competently? How much should we attribute to chance, wind, an arrow, a misaligned chain, and how much to long-term structural breakdown? History keeps its ambiguities close. Our task is to hold them in view. If you found this deep dive into the mechanics of state collapse and the drama of Lake Poyang compelling, leave a comment below. Do you see Zhu as a hero, a tyrant, or both? And if you'd like to keep exploring the tangled intersections of environment, warfare, and political change, check the playlist linked next, and subscribe for more long-form historical investigations.